Welcome to ChariTea and Biscuits, a series of open and honest conversations with those who work in and with the charity sector. Emma, Willder and guests will discuss the issues affecting small UK charities, highlight great resources, and welcome listeners to a wider community of people in the know. Hit the subscribe button now and stay tuned for real behind-the-scenes chat.
Welcome to this edition of ChariTea and Biscuits, and I'm joined today by Les Howard from VATadvice.org. Thanks for joining me today, Les. Would you like to tell everyone a bit about VAT Advice and what you do?
Okay, Emma, great to see you. We've spoken a few times over the years, which has been lovely. So VATadvice.org was originally my business. I started as a freelance VAT specialist in 1994, so that's a scarily long time ago, and done all sorts of things. But in the latter years, probably the last 15 to 20 years, I've focused more and more on working with charities, and obviously I just enjoyed that and meeting some great people doing some really interesting things. But I was still on my own. And then it was very much a telephone call out of the blue about 4.5 years ago with another VAT specialist I knew. One of the things about the VAT world is there's not many people in it, so we all tend to know one another. So this lady was planning on leaving a firm in Cambridge. And she said, well, what tips do you have? So anyway, we got into conversation and we decided, rather than her set up on her own and me giving her advice, that we would go into partnership together. So VATadvice.org ceased to be my freelance business and became a proper business. And now we've added other people. We've got a bit of tech and admin support. So I think today there's 8 of us, either PAYE or self-employed, working with the business. And we work with charities of all shapes and sizes, including a handful of very well-known names, which obviously I won't name for confidentiality, but also some very, very small organisations. We've advised charities whose turnover is less than 10,000, because if they can save £500 of VAT somewhere, it enables them to do what they do. So we've had all sorts of experiences over that time. We do a few tax tribunals. Interestingly, I've got 2 on the way. So it may well be that you'd see me in the tax tribunal limelight later this year with possibly a theatre and possibly a Christian adventure training centre. That's probably the best way of putting it. So those 2 may be on the way to tribunal. So that's unusual. Not many VAT practices would take a case through to tribunal themselves. Usually they would bring in a barrister or other specialists. So it's just a nuance really we add that makes us a little bit different to our competitor practices. So that's a bit of an introduction of us. Eventually I will step back, but I love what we do and I love the people we work with. So why would I want to stop? But I'm sure I will gradually slow down.
You've been saying that for years, Les.
It's true, Emma.
So as you know, Les, VAT is not a simple tax, and it's complicated anyway, but it is even more complicated for charities. And that's one of the reasons that if one of my clients has a VAT query, I would normally say, you need to speak to Les and his team, because actually it's so complicated that I couldn't even begin to find the answer for you. So whilst VAT for charities is such a wide-ranging topic, I think today we're going to focus on things that charities need to consider when they're thinking of diversifying their activities, because as you're probably aware, at the moment, there's a lot of competition for grant funding. COVID has had quite a big impact on charities in that a lot of them had a lot of money thrown at them during COVID, but that's not happened since. But the need is increasing all the time. So a lot of places are looking to diversify their activity. So Les, what would you think would be one of the first things that a charity needs to consider if they're thinking of diversifying their income streams?
I think always ask about VAT. As you said, Emma, look, the VAT book is really thick. That is,
wow.
we call that the orange book for obvious reasons. And that is, it is actually called the orange book. So, that is a hefty tome. And obviously we know our ways around that. It is, if you like, the Charity VAT Bible or the VAT Bible. So, there's a lot to get your heads round. And what we find is that trustees or perhaps a charity manager might just Google and say, well, look, let's see what we can find. And they get, I don't know, 100,000 entries, and they've got to say, decide which ones are right. And it's confusing. And they still find it difficult to reliably make a decision based on that. So let me give you a very current, for instance. In fact, this came out while we were planning this call. Customs put out a business brief, 10 of 22, at the start of June, which talked about the distinction between business and non-business activities for charities. Now, the brief is hopelessly confusing.
That's unusual.
A friend of mine works for, if I can mention another advisor, Stewardship Services, so the big charity bank, and he's very senior there. And he said, Les, is it just me or is this just confusing? And I said, yeah, it is confusing. And it's almost like somebody wrote 20 sentences which were sort of correct-ish and then jumbled them up, because it doesn't follow logically. But it does affect charities, particularly in the childcare sector. So that certainly will be something to flag. It's taken Customs ages to respond to with a change of policy to some case law that we'd seen years ago. So that's a particular area. But in terms of diversification, I think one of the things to understand is that charity VAT law is very unforgiving. It draws a line typically between what's exempt and what's taxable, or between what's business and what's non-business. And for a charity, that can be an all or nothing in terms of its activity. So for example, we are talking to a player in that helps charity lotteries. And so we're looking at their contracts and their arrangements. And, basically it's either everything is taxable or nothing is taxable. And because there's a charity in that chain of supply, which then sells lottery tickets to help fund it, that either passes on a huge cost, 20% cost, or it doesn't. So that's a big difference where the line between, in that case, taxable and exempt is actually very fine. The guidance, again, in that case, doesn't quite address what this organisation delivers. So it's somewhere between the taxable definition and the exempt definition that Customs have provided. So trying to tease out what they're doing, knowing that all parties want the same answer. You say, well, it's not what you want, it's what is going on. But then having established what is happening, one of the things we try and do is say, well, why don't you change what you do? Can you tweak your contracts, tweak your delivery to bring it from taxable to exempt? Because sometimes just a change of what is delivered can make a big difference. Also, I might add that VAT exemptions are applied strictly. That's a wording from the courts over many years. So what they've said is that if it's borderline, it has to be taxable. So in other words, if you want to be exempt, you've got to make a case for being exempt. You can't just assume it's exempt. So again, charities frequently say, oh, well, our sector is exempt, it's all okay. We're in childcare, we're in welfare, we're in education, whatever it may be. And sometimes it isn't okay. We've dealt with, I can think of 3 charities immediately. One in fact, 2 in music, one delivering music in schools, one delivering music in the community, and the other supporting homeless women. And all 3 had just changed something of what they did, and discovered that their activities were exempt, not taxable. All 3 had a huge input tax bill, and all 3, for all 3, the input tax bill exceeded their reserves. So I had to say at quite an early stage, look, worst case scenario is you can't pay, you have to close your doors. And we had to then, I had to say that to the trustees, say, look, that's the situation. It's likely, and that's before we asked about penalties and interest. It's likely that you will not be able to afford these assessments, and you would have to close your doors unless you can get additional funding. And I'm pleased to say all 3 found other sources of funding of gifts and in some cases loans. And all 3 carry on today, which was ever so good, but it was really quite fine at times. And something else just to be aware of for charities, which isn't really, or usually isn't the case in the corporate world, is that the non-profit status of the organization affects VAT exemption. So most exemptions rely not just on the service that is being delivered, but the non-profit status of the charity. So we need to look, for instance, at their constitution or other financial documents to confirm that. And again, we'd say, well, look, we need to change your constitution. We need to put something in place to protect your exemption, or in some cases, to make it taxable, because in some cases, if funding is local authority, they don't mind it being taxable. So you say, okay, let's take it out of the exemption. Let's do it that way. So, but again, those nuances, I don't criticize anybody for not knowing that, because that is really technical stuff.
It is really.
And I was going to say that the non-profit status wording isn't the same everywhere.
No. Where I used to work, it was an education charity. And when I joined, education was obviously exempt. So we had irrecoverable VAT of circa 60k each year, which is a massive amount for a small charity. But I did a little bit of digging, and I went on, I think it was a VAT for Charities webinar or something. And I discovered a nice exemption that if all the profits from your education didn't go directly back into education, you could charge VAT on your education. So we decided to start charging VAT on our education, because everyone was supplying the services to could reclaim that VAT back. So it made no difference to them, but it made a massive difference to where I was working. So we managed to secure £250,000 back just for the 4 years you could go back. And then going forward, we saved a huge amount of irrecoverable VAT each month. But that was only from me going on a webinar and thinking about things. It wasn't obvious. You're right, it's just not obvious. So people automatically assume, well, we're a charity, we don't have to be VAT registered, or we provide this, that doesn't come under that. And it's not true, is it? No,
that's right. So there's another example I can think of, was a small boating club, and they delivered education services because they were training people in river skills, but also they had competitions. So they've actually fell within 2 exemptions. And because they got a big capital project, and therefore they would have lost a lot of input tax, a 6-figure sum, we said, right, we need to look at that, bring you out of the exemption, because your members won't mind paying a little bit more, because they're going to get a flash new, capital building to enjoy. So we changed the constitution. But we did it with explanation, because one of the things with a small charity is once we've done our piece of work, we might get forgotten. And what we don't want to do is leave our changes in the Constitution only for somebody to undo it down the line and therefore undo our good work. So what we did with the wording of the Constitution was, I think it was only 2 clauses, and it was basically saying profits from education will subsidise sports and profits from sports will subsidise education. So getting around both non-profit criteria. But we added in a parenthesis under each of them an explanation, and basically said, don't change this without advice, because if you do, I suppose, I can't think of all the time limits. But again, one of the things with VAT is, although it's a tax on transaction, sometimes if you change circumstances post-transaction, you can affect the VAT that was claimed or was accounted for instance. So you can't just assume it was yesterday, therefore it's okay. So again, it's building that explanation in so that, you know, if we're not around or the trustees all change, they know down the line what not to do, or just to seek advice, to say, oh, you know, 10 years ago, our previous advisor put this into place. Is this still applicable? What if we change this wording now? What are the consequences of that? And there's a lot of variables in that. And even for a small charity, you know, to get that wrong is you know, can be costly. So we tend to think, you know, a sensible fee for good advice, and obviously the advice goes in the trustee file. You know, that is well worth investing in. And also, I think, as with yourselves, to have a good relationship with an advisor is really, really important. So you know the organisation. So this brief I mentioned, when it came out, I immediately thought of 2 charities with advised, and I thought, oh, they might be affected by that because of the way they dedicate part of their building to childcare. So I just wrote, you know, a preemptive email to both of them, say, look, you know, it's difficult to gauge the effects, particularly post-pandemic, because everyone's changed what they did, which I said earlier. But shall we have a call and just to discuss where you are, what you're doing, and whether this brief affects, you know, affects your VAT position. And in one case, we did have to then, we're still in the process of doing it, advise them to change what they're doing and document that. So it's interesting that customs change of policy could have a direct and actually very expensive. It would have been a 6-figure assessment on this organization. Wow. Okay, they're not doing badly, but they don't want to write a check for that.
Nobody wants to write a check for that.
so you know, I think because we work hard at knowing what's going on in our field, you know, we're trying to then flag to organizations we know of, and you know, so obviously, you know, calls like this, just to be aware of that. I've got a quote going in the tax journal in the next couple of weeks on another VAT matter, which again just was dropped in. Nobody announced it. It just was a change of policy that was put through, and I happened to stumble across it. And you think, wow, that's, you know, customs do this, but they don't always highlight that it can be quite significant for a number of organizations. I mean, the little change of policy I mentioned is not charity specific. Yeah, it's a complicated old world. And I think as well, just on the diversification subject, if you change what you do slightly, in the VAT world, that might not be slightly. So education, it might not be education because there is a definition, you know, and certainly education tuition, private tuition is different. Vocational training is different to education. And there's lots of case law on those things, and that changes goalposts periodically. So, you know, an organisation wanting to diversify because it needs to build its funding base may find that its activities no longer fall within education or vocational training, for instance. And therefore you have to revisit that. We deal with a charity in the welfare sector.
I was about to say welfare is one of those tricky ones as well, isn't it?
It's very broad, and it's linked in part to knife crime issues, although it's slightly broader than that. And they deliver quite a range of support to other practitioners in this field, but also beyond that. I'm going to be careful because I think they're quite unique, and I don't want people to say, "Oh, yeah, I know who that is." So what we've created for them, rather than them send us every contract that they ever get, because that would get quite expensive, we've said, well, why don't we create a traffic light system so that your internal managers can triage any contract that comes through for funding, as long as it's over, let's say, 10,000. So, if it's very small, it's probably not worth our while looking at. So we're saying, look, here are flags, and if these red flags appear in the document, then please send it to us and we'll have a review of that. But if all the flags are green, probably as a matter of process, it's not worth you sending it to us. So we're actually in process of that, putting that in place, agreeing that with them. I mean, those flags will be capable of change over the years, but we found, and one or two other organisations we've done the same with, we found that's quite helpful. So where they are, people call them grants, but
they're not always though.
Grants.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, I come across it when I'm preparing statutory accounts and things. I look at the detail, and people might call it a grant, but you look at the detail and it's not.
No.
So you really need to read the wording of the contracts very, very carefully.
Yes. We had some dealings with what will become a high-profile charity in London, and they got a lot of support from their local council. Local
authority grants.
And they sent me 2 or 3, and it was like somebody had done search and replace on Word, and so the word grant appeared everywhere. And I said, no, it's not a grant. There's nothing apart from the title and the fact they've put this in. So I've got this little thing I've invented called #call it a carrot. Now, a carrot is 0 rated, but so here I've got a couple of pens. Now, those are pens. If I put them in a box and wrote carrots on it, it doesn't turn them to carrots, which is 0 rated. They are still pens. So you can't call something a carrot, which is not a carrot. But this local authority obviously had got, frankly, some amateur VAT advice because they thought having grant funding everywhere would solve everybody's VAT problems. But it just confuses, it's just wrong. And if it's not a grant, don't worry, it's not fatal to a VAT outcome. It might be that we make recommendations for changing things, but if it's not a grant, you can't call it a grant. It's a contract for services, which is fine because it could still be exempt from VAT in any case. Or in actual fact, in some cases in this one, some of them are taxable, which is fine because the VAT washes through. So again, it's just this ignorance of the complication of VAT rules, sometimes even by big players, that the outcomes are unpredictable. You can't just say, oh, it's VAT-free, therefore there's no VAT cost, because if that organisation has had to invest in premises, staff training, IT, which all carry VAT, then if it's a non-business grant, they lose that VAT anyway. So they've got to be paid for. So, it's just a failure to understand that. So actually, a lot of charities are very happy making taxable supplies. for VAT purposes. They're still properly charities. That's okay. But it's just that, complication and failure to understand that. So I think, if you like, the unique selling point of firms like ours is that the return on investment can be huge, because you're giving certainty, and clarifying what can be extremely confusing. One of my other little sayings is, we give you back your sleep, because a lot of people find that VAT gives them sleepless nights.
It is so complicated. I mean, as you know, I'm an accountant, and even I read some of the charity stuff, and I'm like, I don't actually know where this leaves it.
Yeah.
And that's when I go, Les, what do you know about this?
I think it's good. And one of the things we enjoy working with you, one reason why I enjoy working with you, Emma, is that you know what you don't know. So if something comes across your desk, you say, we know we don't know that. Let's talk to Les and his team. And I think that's really important for any of us in whatever sector. Where we're competent, and we're happy with that. It's not arrogant, that's who we are. That's why people come to us. But where something crosses the line and it's outside our competence or understanding, we say, okay, we don't know that. The best advice is to find somebody who does know that. And that's not a negative, that's a positive. And too often people are Googling to try and expand their knowledge when it's just no good. And I think the honesty and humility to bring in someone else who is a respected professional in their field is so valuable. And you build up obviously the partnerships like we have, and that can serve charity clients ever so well.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the values at Beyond Profit is we are knowledgeable, but that is, we know what we know, but we're also happy to admit what we don't know.
That's
but
it.
We know people who know what we don't know, so we can go to them.
Perfect. We must find turn that into a couple of really good strap lines.
Yes,
we know what we know, we know what we don't know.
But we know who to go to for that.
That's it, yeah. And it's good. And again, it's where there's an existing relationship, to bring somebody in is really valuable. And in the charity world, relationships are so important, because it's to do with people at the end of the day. We're helping, okay, some charities help animals, but you're helping the people who look after those animals. But yeah, we're all in the people business, and therefore relationships are so important. And that's why, back to my exit strategy, is people I've got to know, people who are friends. You can't transfer a friendship easily. Yeah, that's interesting, but it's very rewarding as well.
I think that's why a lot of us work in the charity sector, because it's so rewarding. I mean, I often say to people, nobody works in or with the charity sector for the money. They do it because they bloody love it. Because they love the people who work in there, because they're so passionate about what they do. So it's not good to know that we have those shared values as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was lovely. We had a Jubilee Street party, whenever it was, seems ages ago, probably only about 2 weeks ago. It might have been 3 weeks ago. And it was lovely. There's a bit of a green space in our road. So we put up 4 barbecues and chairs and tables, and everybody came out with food. And one of the families is related to a family that runs an Italian restaurant in town. So we had these great cakes and stuff, and the barbecue, all the different barbecue food, etc. Anyway, we'd invited a friend of ours who hosts a Ukrainian refugee family. And it's lovely, they came. And it's a family of 3. One of the members is blind, but is still working via their laptop, earning a living in Ukraine. as a lawyer. And I just thought that was lovely. And I don't know the whole journey in terms of paperwork and organization, but, you know, there are good, you know, well-known charitable organizations helping that process. And you think, yeah, somewhere in that line is us serving them, you know, slightly burnt burgers and sausages. And they were at our street party. And I thought, how lovely, you know, to give them an experience which, you know, well, certainly since February this year, they'd not had, because they'd left their home on Invasion Day +1, you know, and they'd spent most of the preceding 4 months getting from a big city in Ukraine to a little town in Cambridgeshire. So yeah, just to be in that big interaction of charitable organizations and people that just want to help, you know, and all I did was make burgers, you know, and it's, yeah, it was really lovely. So yeah, I love all those interactions and those stories that we can be part of. It's so precious. Why wouldn't I want to get out of bed and do all that?
Exactly. Oh, thank you so much for joining me today, Les. It's been really interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought for people to think about and ponder. And thank you again. And I look forward to talking to my next person at the next Charity and Biscuits.